Hi everybody, it's time. What is it time for? To be determined, but we're going to try to turn Fred into bread. Starter farm bread. I will post this. Now, I know I've said this 1,000 times, but these are early days, so I am extremely skeptical that I will get any leavening power out of Fred in order to actually make bread. However, we're going to see what happens. So this process, turning Fred into bread, is going to take about 8 hours. It's not 8 active hours. I'm going to mix the dough. There's going to be a period of fermentation. Fermentation is when we let all the good activity in Fred find new sources of sugar and starches in the flour that we're going to put in. I'm going to do a few folds. I'll show you those. And then I'll do some shaping. And then once Fred is shaped, there's going to be a period of time when Fred is proofing, and that's when the yeast and all the good natural yeast activity in Fred is proving to us that it's working. So what I want to show you right now is how to mix Fred. So it's been about 36 hours since I last fed him, but he's okay. It's a little cooler out right now. He has not moved that much from last night, but the flavor, the aroma is still good. And so what I'm going to do is, I've got my bowl, I'm going to add, I'm going to start with my water in the bowl. I'm going to go ahead and just I've got everything measured out already. This is 520 grams of water. And then what I'm going to do, just tear out my scale here, is I'm going to get a little bit of water in my hands. I need 275 grams of Fred. Alright, 281. We're going to live with that. And then whatever's stuck to my hands. Alright. Perfect. Now, to my water and my flour, my water and my starter, I'm going to get about half of my all-purpose red flour. And we start with half the flour just because it's easier to hydrate half than it is to get it all in there. And the all-purpose flour that I'm using, it's got a protein content of 11.3%. King Arthur all-purpose flour, their protein content, which refers to the potential for developing gluten, is 11.7%. You can also use their bread flour. That'd be totally fine. I'm going to get the rest of my all-purpose in. I'm not crazy about baking bread with something like gold medal because the protein content tends to be lower and it varies a lot depending on from bag to bag of flour. So, all-purpose in, I'm going to get some whole wheat flour in. And I'm also going to get my salt in. So the recipe calls for 4 teaspoons of sea salt or 23 grams. I actually don't have sea salt here. I have iodized salt, but I have plenty of kosher salt. So because I'm doing it by weight, I just did 23 grams of salt. I'm going to get that in. And you could use your spoon, but I'm just going to use my card because my spoon is only going to be worthwhile for about 10 seconds. So rounded edge of the card, really pressing the flour in. And this is a lot of dough, so make sure that you're using the right size bowl. So when you get tired of being in your bowl, you can get out onto the table, scrape everything out. And this makes 2 loaves of farm bread. So what I'm going to do is I need to knead this dough. And when you knead a dough, you are developing the proteins in the flour. Proteins are called glutenin and gliadinin. When you add moisture, like we did with the water, and then you add movement, you start to develop them. So flip around to the flat side of my card. And I'm folding, I'm pressing, I'm turning. You can sort of take, imagine there's a name for it, but if you put one foot in front of the other, it's kind of like a kneading warrior stance. You're going to scrape off your hand. So a few things about kneading dough. One is that we never add more flour down. You'll notice the dough is pretty sticky, and that's because if you add more flour down, you are changing the recipe. I weighed everything out. I trust my scale, and I don't want to add more more flour than the recipe calls for. Just going to dry it out and change the recipe. The other thing is that you can knead on any surface. What's nice about wood is that when you're sticking a lot in one spot, if you scrape everything up, move to a slightly drier spot, it's not going to stick as much. These are I'm pretty early on in the kneading process. And the last thing I'll say about kneading is that if you just stand here and do this is not kneading. This is what a cat does when it's looking for a spot to lie down. So, I'm not at Bake. I can't come take your dough away from you and show you a better way to knead. But I'm going to keep doing this for about 8 to 10 minutes. And then when I'm done, I'm going to show you. I'm going to set a timer for myself, and I'll show you what my dough looks like at that point, and then I'm going to put it in a container to ferment. So, I've got this amount of dough. It's going to take 8 to 10 minutes to knead. I'm a pretty efficient kneader, so probably only about 8 minutes. But if kneading dough is new to you, it might take you a little bit longer. I always suggest putting on some good music, set a timer. People always ask, how do I know if I'm done kneading? And it varies from recipe to recipe, depending on what they want you to do, but it really is a good idea to set a timer. There's something called the window pane test, which I can show you when I'm done with this dough. But right now, and the window pane test is a testament to how much strength the dough has built up. So right now, if I take a piece of this dough and I tear it and I try to spread it out, you see how easily it tears. When I've developed the gluten after kneading for 8 to 10 minutes, I'm going to be able to get to this point, I'm going to be able to get this dough to a point where I can see through it, but it holds the structure. So I'm going to keep going. And it's still a little sticky. That's okay. Don't worry about that. Scrape off your hands, move to a drier spot on the table, and keep going. All right, so it's been about 8 minutes, 9 minutes. My dough is a lot smoother than it was earlier. I can touch it with the back of my hand and it's not sticking. I still have a little bit of dough on my hands, but that's to be expected. And so what I want to show you is something called the window pane test. And you want to cut off a pretty good sized piece of dough. If you cut off a piece of dough that's that big, you're going to have a hard time stretching it out properly. I can stretch it out, and then I hold it up to the light, and you should be able to see through it. There should be a thin membrane, and that's the window pane test right there. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Could I go for 15 more seconds? Sure, we'll go for 15 more seconds. And then I've got a container that I've sprayed with some pan spray. All right, so it's been 1 hour. It's time to do a fold on Fred. We do Fred bread, the bread of Fred. We do folds because sometimes there can be temperature differences between the bottom of the dough and the middle of the dough. We kind of want to even that out. We also want to wiggle the yeast around a little bit. So think of it as kind of like a little mini knead, okay? When you have a huge amount of dough, like they do in the bread bakery, they're dealing with 200, 300 pounds of dough, that temperature difference can be pretty substantial. You're probably not going to find much in this amount of dough right here. So I sprinkled a little bit of flour on the table. You don't want to put down a ton of flour. You may need to ease the dough out of there. Not much has happened in this last hour when expected to. And then when you do a fold, you want to pat the dough out. Back in the day, sometimes you'll see recipes where they talk about punching the dough down. This is a gentler approach to that. So you can pat it out to a rectangle, And then what I like to do is north to the middle, south to the middle, kind of gently stretching, east to the middle, and west to the middle. And then I take the whole thing. If I have excess flour, I brush it off, pop it back in the container. Sometimes you can respray the container if you're worried about it sticking. And I'm going to do that 2 more times over the course of the next 2 hours. All right, so it's been 4 hours since I first mixed the dough, and it's been 3 hours since I did my first fold. And I did 3 folds every hour in that time period. And I'll write this all down. So this is what's happened in the last 4 hours. Not a whole lot. I've made farm bread with a really active starter, one that's fed regularly, the one they've had at the bakehouse for years. And I know at this point that this dough should be at the top of this container. So, like I said, early days, I didn't expect much was going to happen, but I'll show you how we're going to shape it. So, I've got 2 things here. This is a willow basket, and this is, if you've ever gotten the farm bread or a lot of other loaves at the bakehouse, the way it's built, these lines are really nice in terms of adding making the bread look nice. But if you don't have one of these, another option is I've got this really thin tea towel here, and I've got it in a metal bowl, 4-quart metal bowl. And so I've got a little bit of flour here, just all-purpose flour, and it's really best if you sift this in. That's the best way to get coverage all the way around. I'm a little wary of this one. I've had much more stalwart tea towels in my time, but we'll see how this one holds up. So you want to prepare your baskets. This one out of the way. And then what I want to do is I can leave some of that flour that's on the table. Okay. And I want to divide this dough into 2 pieces about the same size. And so I'm going to weigh them because I've got my scale here. I'm going to take my bench knife and do a carpenter's cut, which is where you measure once and you say, oh, I think that's about half and half, and then you commit to it. And I'm going to weigh, see how I did my eyeballing. So 822, I think this one's a little bit bigger. Come here. Oh, 818. Not too shabby. I'm not making that up either, really. So we're going to leave those alone. I'm okay with that. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do what's called a pre-shape. And pre-shape is letting the dough get used to the fact that it is going to be a round loaf in this case because I have, sorry, I hope you can see that, because I have round baking dishes. So for a pre-shape, what I'm going to do is a couple ways. You pick the dough up, and what you can just sort of gently, I'm bringing the outside, the top of the dough to the center underneath, like making a giant mushroom cap. Okay, I don't have any flour on my hands. I don't need it. A little bit of flour wouldn't hurt. And you want to go around a fair amount of times, but you don't want to tear the surface of the dough, okay? I'll do a few more times. I've noticed that some of the bran in the whole wheat has popped to the top of the loaf. And then I'm going to give it a good firm pinch on the bottom, okay? For right now, I'm going to set this in the area where I've got a soft, little bit of flour down. I'm going to do the same over here. Your other option for shaping is if you've got the dough on the table, you want to get the excess flour out of the way. And then what I do is I'm using the outside, my pinkies, and you're pushing the dough towards you and then away from you with the outside of your hand. And when you're doing that, you're gathering the dough underneath in the center. Okay? Kind of pull it towards you a few times. If you have a lot of flour down and you're trying to shape on the table, what'll end up happening is the dough will just move around the table and you won't actually create any surface tension. Okay. All right, so that's the pre-shape right now. I'm going to set that on the table, and then I am going to get some plastic wrap. I'm going to cover these, and I'm going to come back to them in about 25 minutes. All right, so it's been about 25 minutes. 20 minutes to be fine, 30 minutes to be fine. Just important that you keep your bread covered at this point in time. For the pre-shapes, now I'm going to do a final shape. And we keep the dough covered so it doesn't get a skin and dry out, because you don't want to then incorporate that into your bread. And so, what I'm going to do is exactly like I did the first time around with the pre-shape. Now, let me tell you what this dough feels like. Normally, when you are making the farm bread and you're using a starter that's had a lot of time to develop, that's been really active, that's kind of captured all that good natural yeast activity, this dough should feel very buoyant, should feel very light, should be full of gas. It should be good, full of carbon dioxides, acids, and ethanols. And that's what happens with yeast, natural yeast or commercial yeast, is as it gets in there and it finds the sugars and the starches to eat in the flour, it's going to burp out good activity, and it's going to help leaven your bread, help rise your bread up. And because we spent so much time kneading the dough, we created, think of it like a very small chain link fence. The proteins, gluten and gliadin, when you knead them and you create the structure, that tiny chain link fence, helps to capture all those good yeasty, gassy activity. This dough is very heavy. It has almost no lift to it. It's got almost no lightness to it. I feel like I could do some damage with this bread. However, we're going to go through the process. So I'm really going to pinch this. I'm honestly probably going to go around again with some flour because I'm so afraid of this sticking in here. Okay, and then I'm going to put this seam side up, because when you bake this, what you do is you tip your willow basket over onto the baking sheet. So have a look at that now. Okay, if you could see where it is, it's going to settle out. It's going to sort of pool to fill in, and ideally it would grow to almost fill this basket. I don't think that's going to happen because it is early days, but we're going to leave it alone. We'll give it 3 to 4 hours, which is what you normally do when you are working with a fully developed starter. So cover that one. Okay, set that out of the way. And then same thing here. I'm going to cover this with another piece of plastic wrap, and I'm going to come back in about 3 hours and see if anything has happened. So that's how you make a dough out of the starter. I'm going to show you the loaf. I'm going to show you how I baked it, and I'm going to tell you how it tastes, and, spoiler alert, it doesn't taste like much, you know. But right now, it just isn't right, and we're going to talk about that. And that's day 6. Thanks so much. Have a good night.